Captain Jake Morrison stared out the bridge window of the USS Defiance and watched death approach in the form of silver ships. The Zathari fleet moved like hunting wolves across the black space, their hulls gleaming with technology that made his ship look like an old fishing boat. Jake counted 12 vessels, each one bigger than his own, each one carrying enough firepower to turn a moon into dust. The Defiance was 112 years old, built back when humans still thought aliens were just stories. Her hull was patched with metal from 3 different planets. Her weapons were the kind museums put on display, and her crew was made up of people the Navy had forgotten about. Jake looked around his bridge and saw the faces of 43 men and women who had nowhere else to go. Lieutenant Amy Foster bent over her tactical screen, her young face tight with worry. She had graduated from the academy just 2 years ago, and this was supposed to be a quiet posting in the outer colonies. Now she was looking at weapon readings that made no sense. The alien ships carried energy weapons that could slice through their armor like a hot knife through butter. Chief Engineer Dan Sullivan climbed up from the engine room, oil stains on his uniform and concern in his eyes. He had been keeping the Defiance running for 15 years with spare parts and prayer. The ship's fusion reactor was older than most of the crew and held together with welds that would make a safety inspector cry. Dan shook his head when Jake looked at him with questioning eyes. The communication system crackled to life with a voice that sounded like metal scraping against stone. The alien commander spoke in perfect English, which somehow made it worse. The voice was cold and certain, like someone reading a grocery list. It told them to surrender their primitive vessel and prepare to be destroyed if they refused. Jake had been in space for 28 years, fighting pirates and rebels in forgotten corners of human space. He had seen good ships die and good people with them, but he had never faced anything like this. The Zathari Confederation had been at war with humanity for 3 years now, and they were winning. Their technology was centuries ahead of anything humans could build. The aliens had taken 6 human colonies already, each time announcing their victory with the same cold voice. They called humans a primitive species that should be grateful to serve their betters. Jake had heard the recordings from the fallen worlds, had seen the fear in the survivors' eyes when they spoke of Zathari efficiency. Behind him, weapons specialist Sam Carter was running diagnostics on their missile systems. The results were not good. Their conventional warheads would barely scratch the alien shields, and they only had 36 missiles left. Sam had been a mining engineer before the war started, and he knew more about explosives than weapons. But explosives were explosives, and Sam was starting to get. Ideas navigator Lisa Kim plotted their position relative to the asteroid field that surrounded the mining colony of New Perth. The colony had been evacuated 2 days ago when long-range sensors detected the Zathari fleet. Now it was just the Defiance and 40,000 tons of mining equipment floating in space, waiting for someone to claim them. Jake thought about the miners who had lived on New Perth. They were tough people who had carved a life out of rock and vacuum. They had trusted the Navy to protect them, and the Navy had sent the Defiance. One old ship with old weapons and an older crew. It felt like a joke, except nobody was laughing. Communications Officer Ryan Clark was monitoring alien transmissions, and what he heard made his blood boil. The Zathari were discussing the human ship like it was an interesting museum piece. They wondered if they should capture it intact to study primitive human technology. One of them suggested it might make a good training target for their junior officers. The Zathari had perfect ships with perfect crews and perfect tactics. They fought wars like they were solving math problems with cold logic and calculated moves. They had never lost a battle because they never made mistakes. Their computer systems could predict every human strategy and counter it before human captains even finished giving orders. Jake looked at his crew again and saw something the aliens would never understand. He saw Sam Carter thinking about mining charges and Lisa Kim studying asteroid positions with the focused intensity of someone born in space. He saw Amy Foster checking weapon systems that had no right to work but somehow did. He saw Dan Sullivan calculating power flows in his head while planning modifications that would make engineers scream. The Defiance was old and patched and forgotten, but she was crewed by humans who had spent their lives making impossible things work. They were miners and engineers and mechanics who had learned to fix anything with whatever they could find. They were people who had grown up on worlds where making a mistake meant dying in vacuum. Jake made his decision. He could run, but the Zathari ships were faster. He could surrender, But that would just mean dying on his knees instead of his feet. Or he could fight and maybe teach these perfect aliens that humans were not quite as primitive as they looked. Maybe show them that sometimes the old ways worked better than the new ones. He turned to his crew and saw them waiting for orders. They knew the odds as well as he did, but they were still here. They could have requested transfers to newer ships or safer posts, but they had stayed with the old Defiance. They had stayed because this was their ship, and these were their people. Jake opened a channel to the Zathari fleet and spoke in a voice that carried across space to the perfect ships with their perfect crews. He told them that the USS Defiance would not surrender. He told them that if they wanted his ship, they would have to come and take it. Then he closed the channel and turned to his crew with a smile that was part determination and part pure human stubbornness. The Zathari commander's response came quickly, transmitted on all frequencies so everyone could hear. The alien voice was amused now, like an adult watching a child play with toy soldiers. It promised that the human ship would be destroyed quickly and efficiently, as befitted such a primitive vessel. The transmission ended with what might have been alien laughter. Jake Morrison looked out at the approaching fleet and felt something cold settle in his stomach. But alongside the fear was something else, something that had kept humanity alive on 100 hostile worlds. It was the stubborn refusal to lie down and die just because someone else said you should. It was the human habit of finding a way when there was no way. It was the thing that had carried his species from caves to the stars. Sam Carter stared at the mining charges stacked in Cargo Bay 3 and felt his mind start working in ways the Academy had never taught him. The charges were meant for breaking apart asteroids, but explosives were explosives. He had spent 10 years in the asteroid mines before joining the Navy, and he knew these charges could punch holes in solid rock 3 meters thick. The Zathari ships were closing in with the confidence of predators who had never met prey that fought back effectively. Their formation was perfect, their spacing calculated to provide maximum firepower coverage. Sam looked at those perfect ships and started thinking about how miners dealt with problems that could not be solved with textbook answers. Down in engineering, Dan Sullivan was having thoughts that would have horrified his old instructors. The Defiance's fusion reactor was ancient by modern standards, but it was also built like a tank. The new ships had safer reactors with automatic shutoffs and computer controls that prevented dangerous overloads. The Defiance had manual controls and an engineer who was not afraid to push them past their limits. Dan had been running the reactor hot for 3 days, storing extra power in the ship's capacitors. Modern ships would have shut down automatically to prevent damage, but the Defiance was too old to know she should not be able to do what Dan was making her do. He looked at power readings that made him sweat and started planning modifications that would either save them all or blow them to pieces. Lisa Kim was studying the asteroid field with the intensity of someone who had grown up navigating between rocks in space. The Zathari ships were designed for open space combat, with long-range weapons and perfect sensors. But Lisa had learned to fly in asteroid fields where one mistake meant becoming part of the scenery. She started plotting courses that would make the alien captains very nervous. Amy Foster was running simulations on her tactical computer, and everyone showed the same result. The Defiance would last approximately 4 minutes against the Zathari fleet in open combat. Their shields would fail, their hull would crack, and their crew would die in the cold vacuum of space. But Amy was starting to realize that maybe they did not need to fight the kind of battle the computer expected. Ryan Clark was listening to Zathari communications and learning things about their enemy that textbooks had never mentioned. The aliens coordinated everything through their computers, with each ship linked to a central command system. They moved like parts of a single machine, which made them incredibly efficient. But it also meant they thought like a machine, and machines could be predictable. The Zathari had studied human military tactics and found them wanting. Human admirals were too emotional. Human captains took unnecessary risks, and human crews made mistakes that proper computer systems would never allow. The aliens had programmed their ships to counter every standard human strategy, and their confidence came from the certainty that they had prepared for everything. But the crew of the Defiance was not thinking about standard strategies. They were thinking about mining operations and jury-rigged equipment, and the 100 small tricks that kept old ships running in deep space. They were thinking about the tools they actually had instead of the weapons they wished they had. Sam Carter started moving through the ship, talking to anyone who had worked in the mines. There were more of them than he had expected, people who had come to the Navy from the hard jobs on the edge of human space. They understood his ideas immediately, and they started gathering equipment that had never been designed for combat, but might work anyway. Chief Petty Officer Mike Turner had spent 15 years setting charges in asteroid mines, and he knew exactly how to make rocks move in directions that gravity never intended. He looked at the asteroid field around New Perth and saw opportunities that would never occur to someone who had learned warfare from computers. He started calculating blast patterns in his head while his hands worked on timing circuits. Dr. Helen Price was supposed to be a medical officer, but she had trained as a mining safety specialist before joining the Navy. She knew how to work in vacuum, how to move through spaces that were never meant for human bodies, and how to jury-rig life support systems with whatever materials were available. She started thinking about how those skills might apply to boarding actions. Security Chief Ben Rodriguez had been a colonial marshal before the war, chasing criminals through asteroid belts and mining stations. He knew how to fight in close quarters with improvised weapons, and he knew how to move through industrial environments that would confuse someone used to clean ship corridors. He started checking the armory for tools that were not technically weapons but might serve the purpose. Jake Morrison walked through his ship and saw his crew transforming from Navy personnel into something the Zathari would not recognize. They were becoming miners and engineers and frontier workers again, people who solved problems with whatever they could find. They were remembering skills that the modern Navy had tried to train out of them. The Zathari fleet was sending status reports to their command ship, confident that they would complete their mission within the hour. Their computers had calculated optimal firing solutions, their shields were calibrated to deflect human weapons, and their formation was designed to eliminate any possibility of escape. Everything was proceeding according to their projections. But projections assumed that humans would behave like rational military opponents, using standard tactics and conventional weapons. The Zathari computers had no data on mining charges used as guided missiles, or industrial equipment modified for combat, or crews that treated their ship like a mobile construction site instead of a military vessel. Jake stood on his bridge and felt the ship around him changing. The Defiance was still old and patched and outgunned, but she was becoming something else. She was becoming a tool in the hands of people who had spent their lives making tools do things they were never designed for. She was becoming a weapon that no computer could predict because she had never existed before. The crew worked with the focused intensity of people who knew their lives depended on getting everything right the first time. They moved through familiar routines that had nothing to do with military procedure and everything to do with staying alive in dangerous places. They prepared for battle the way miners prepared for dangerous shifts. With careful planning and improvised solutions, Amy Foster looked at her tactical display and realized that all her training had been preparation for fighting other human ships with predictable weapons and familiar tactics. She was about to fight aliens who thought they had humans figured out, using methods that had never been tried in space combat. Her computer could not help her now, but her instincts could. The Zathari ships moved into final attack position, their weapons powered, and their shields at maximum strength. They had given the humans time to surrender and been refused, so now they would demonstrate the futility of primitive species challenging their superiors. Their computers confirmed that all systems were optimal and victory was assured. The first Zathari energy beam split the darkness like a sword made of light, aimed precisely at the Defiance's engine section. Jake Morrison threw his ship into a rolling dive that would have torn apart a newer vessel, but the old warship held together with the stubbornness of something built to last. The beam missed by 3 meters and carved a glowing line across the surface of a nearby asteroid. Lisa Kim sent the Defiance diving into the asteroid field like a fish seeking deep water, the ship's hull groaning as she pushed the old vessel through maneuvers that challenged every safety protocol ever written. The Zathari ships followed with careful precision, their computers calculating safe paths through the floating rocks while maintaining optimal firing positions. The alien formation was beautiful in its perfection, each ship positioned to provide covering fire for the others while avoiding the larger asteroids. Their sensors painted detailed pictures of every rock, and their computers plotted courses that would bring them within optimal weapons range in exactly 4 minutes and 37 seconds. Everything was proceeding according to their projections. Mike Turner watched the alien ships move into the killing zone he had spent 2 hours preparing, and his finger hovered over the detonation controls. The mining charges were placed throughout the asteroid field, hidden in rocks that looked identical to thousands of others. The charges were connected to proximity sensors salvaged from mining equipment, set to trigger when large metal objects passed nearby. The lead Zathari cruiser passed the first marker asteroid, its shields glowing with contained energy that could deflect any conventional weapon. The ship's computers noted the asteroid as a minor navigation hazard and calculated a course adjustment to avoid collision. The proximity sensor hidden inside the rock detected the massive alien vessel and sent a signal. To Mike Turner's console, Turner pressed the detonation button with the calm satisfaction of a man who had spent years moving rocks in space. The asteroid exploded like a flower made of stone and fire, sending chunks of iron-rich ore in every direction at velocities that no computer had been programmed to expect. The fragments struck the Zathari cruiser faster than its automated defense systems could track. The alien shields flared and sparked as they tried to deflect impacts they had never been designed to handle. Military weapons followed predictable patterns and came from expected directions, but asteroid fragments tumbled through space with chaotic rotations that no targeting computer could predict. Some pieces bounced off the shields, but others found gaps and weak points that perfect weapons never would have discovered. More explosions bloomed throughout the asteroid field as the Zathari ships triggered trap after trap, their perfect formation becoming a liability as flying rocks struck vessels that had moved too close together. The aliens tried to adjust their positions, but every movement brought them within range of another hidden charge. Sam Carter watched the chaos unfold on his tactical display and felt a grim satisfaction, as his improvised minefield proved more effective than any missile barrage. The Zathari had studied human weapons extensively, but they had never bothered to learn about human mining techniques. They had prepared for military opposition, not industrial sabotage. While the alien ships struggled with the unexpected kinetic bombardment, Carter unleashed his modified mining lasers. The industrial beams were designed to cut through solid rock and metal ore, focused with the precision needed to carve up asteroids without damaging valuable minerals. They operated on frequencies that military shield generators had never been tested against. The mining lasers sliced through Zathari shields like they were made of colored glass instead of hardened energy fields. The beams found resonance frequencies that caused the shield generators to overload and fail, leaving the alien hulls exposed to direct attack. Carter fired again and again, each shot precisely aimed at critical systems that industrial tools were perfectly designed to destroy. Admiral Vexhai stood on the bridge of his command ship and watched his perfect formation dissolve into confusion as his vessels were attacked by weapons that should not exist. His computers could not identify the human weapon signatures because they were not weapons at all, just tools being used in ways their creators never intended. The Zathari had fought 17 different species over the past 1,000 years, and they had defeated everyone by studying their military capabilities and developing superior counters. But humans were proving to be something new, something that did not fight wars the way civilized species were supposed to fight them. Vexhai's tactical officer reported damage to 3 ships and the complete failure of their predictive combat algorithms. The humans were using their environment as a weapon, turning the asteroid field itself into a battleground that favored improvisation over planning. The Admiral's computers had no data on how to counter such tactics. Jake Morrison felt the Defiance shudder as a Zathari beam grazed their port shield generator, but Dan Sullivan's modifications held the defensive screen together through pure stubborn engineering. The ship's power systems were running far beyond their rated capacity, drawing energy from sources that safety manuals said should never be connected to the main grid. Amy Foster targeted the nearest alien cruiser and fired their conventional missiles, not expecting them to penetrate Zathari shields but hoping to add to the confusion. The missiles detonated harmlessly against the energy barriers, but they forced the alien ship to adjust its position just as another hidden mine exploded nearby. The alien vessel staggered under multiple impacts from asteroid fragments, its perfect hull plating cracked in bleeding atmosphere. The ship's automated systems tried to seal the breaches, but human mining charges had been designed to create maximum fragmentation, and the damage was spreading faster than the repairs could keep up. Ryan Clark jammed Zathari communications using an old civilian broadcasting array that had been left behind when New Perth was evacuated. The transmitter was designed for entertainment and emergency broadcasts, not electronic warfare, but it pumped out enough interference to disrupt the alien coordination signals. The Zathari ships began to lose their perfect synchronization as their computer links failed one by one. Without constant data sharing, their formation started to break down and their tactical responses became slower and less coordinated. The aliens had built their entire military doctrine around networked computer systems, and they were discovering the weakness of that approach. Jake watched his crew work with the efficiency of people who had learned their skills in places where mistakes were fatal. They moved through combat routines that had never been taught in any military academy, using equipment that had never been designed for warfare. They fought like miners and engineers and frontier workers, because that was what they were. The battle raged through the asteroid field as the Defiance led the confused Zathari ships deeper into the maze of floating rocks and hidden explosives. Each alien vessel that tried to pursue found itself facing new traps and unexpected attacks from directions that military computers had never been programmed to consider. The humans were fighting a war that had no rules because they were making up the rules as they went. Dan Sullivan wiped sweat from his forehead as he watched power readings that would have made his engineering instructors faint. The Defiance's old fusion reactor was running at 130% capacity, feeding energy into capacitor banks that had been jury-rigged from mining equipment and spare parts. The whole system should have exploded an hour ago, but Sullivan had been coaxing impossible performance from dying machines for most of his adult life. The extra power flowed into the ship's ancient railguns, weapons that most modern vessels had replaced with energy beams and guided missiles. The magnetic accelerators were simple technology, just metal rails that used electromagnetic fields to throw projectiles at high velocity. But simple technology could be modified in ways that complex systems could not. Sullivan had spent 3 hours rewiring the railgun capacitors to accept power directly from the fusion reactor, bypassing every safety system and regulation that stood between the guns and catastrophic overload. The modifications would destroy the weapons after a few shots, but those few shots would hit with force that no Zathari shield generator had ever been designed to handle. Amy Foster felt the ship shudder as the overcharged railguns came online, their magnetic fields interfering with every other system on the ship. Her targeting computer flickered and died, leaving her with manual controls and the kind of instinctive shooting skills that modern officers never had to learn. She aimed by feel and experience, the way gunners had done for centuries before computers took over. The first tungsten slug left the railgun at 12,000 meters per second, moving so fast that it appeared on Zathari sensors as a brief flicker before impact. The projectile struck the lead alien cruiser's shield with kinetic energy that no defensive system had been programmed to deflect. The shield collapsed like a soap bubble, and the slug continued through the hull with barely diminished velocity. Admiral Vexhai watched in shock as his flagship's main computer core disappeared in a spray of molten metal and sparking circuits. The tungsten slug had punched completely through his ship, leaving a perfectly round hole that bled atmosphere and secondary explosions. His tactical officers scrambled to understand how a primitive kinetic weapon had defeated their most advanced defensive systems. The second railgun fired, and another Zathari ship staggered as its shield generator overloaded and died. The aliens had based their shield technology on deflecting energy weapons and guided missiles, threats that could be predicted and countered. But solid projectiles moving at relativistic speeds created impacts that their computers had never been programmed to handle. Ben Rodriguez led his security team through the corridors of the Defiance, checking weapons and equipment that would have looked primitive to anyone familiar with modern military gear. They carried mining tools and construction equipment, items that had been modified for combat by people who understood that sometimes the simplest solutions were the most effective. The security team wore mining suits that had been reinforced with armor plating salvaged from damaged cargo containers. The suits were designed for working in vacuum and hostile environments, with life support systems that could operate independently for hours. They looked clumsy compared to military armor, but they worked, and that was what mattered. Dr. Helen Price coordinated damage control throughout the ship, directing repair teams with the calm efficiency of someone who had spent years dealing with industrial accidents in deep space. Her medical training was useful, but her engineering background was invaluable as she helped keep the Defiance's jury-rigged systems functioning under combat stress. The ship shook as another Zathari energy beam found its target, overloading the starboard shield and sending sparks cascading from damaged power conduits. Price's repair team swarmed over the damage like ants, welding patches and rerouting power through backup systems that had not been used in decades. Jake Morrison felt his ship dying around him, but she was taking enemies with her. 2 Zathari cruisers were drifting helplessly with their main systems destroyed, and a third was limping away from the battle with its hull cracked open like an egg. The aliens were learning that sometimes old weapons worked better than new ones. The Zathari fleet tried to adjust their tactics, but their computers could not adapt to weapons and strategies that had never existed in their databases. They had spent centuries perfecting their military doctrine against civilized opponents who fought according to predictable rules. The humans were proving to be anything but predictable. Sam Carter launched a spread of mining charges modified with guidance systems salvaged from cargo handling equipment. The improvised missiles moved with clumsy trajectories that confused Zathari point defense systems designed to intercept sleek military weapons. The charges exploded against alien hulls with the devastating force of industrial explosives never meant for space combat. Ryan Clark intercepted frantic Zathari communications as the alien commanders tried to understand what they were facing. The enemy had expected to fight a primitive human warship with conventional weapons and standard tactics. Instead, they found themselves battling something that seemed to operate outside all known military doctrine. The aliens were discovering that humans did not fight wars the way other species did. They did not rely on perfect technology or flawless coordination. They improvised and adapted and used whatever tools they could find. They fought like people who had learned to survive on hostile worlds where the environment itself was trying to kill them. Lisa Kim guided the Defiance through another series of impossible maneuvers, using the asteroid field like a three-dimensional maze where size and firepower mattered less than skill and knowledge. She had grown up navigating through space debris and mining equipment, and she knew how to make the environment work for her instead of against her. The third railgun fired, its overloaded capacitors screaming in protest as they dumped their energy into the magnetic accelerator. The tungsten slug struck a Zathari destroyer amidships, the kinetic impact tearing through advanced armor like it was made of paper. The alien ship broke apart in a shower of debris and escaping atmosphere. Admiral Vexhai realized with growing horror that his perfect fleet was being systematically destroyed by a single human vessel that should have been scrapped decades ago. His tactical computers could not explain how primitive weapons were penetrating advanced shields, or how obsolete equipment was outperforming cutting-edge technology. The battle was turning into something that violated every principle of modern warfare. The humans were not following any recognizable strategy or using any identifiable weapons. They were fighting like savages who had learned to use tools, and they were winning because their enemies had forgotten that sometimes the oldest ways were the most effective. Jake Morrison looked at his battered crew and saw people who had refused to accept defeat, even when defeat seemed certain. They had taken a dying ship and turned it into something that could stand against the most advanced fleet in known space. They had proven that human ingenuity and determination could overcome any technological advantage, as long as they were willing to fight dirty and think outside the rules. The surviving Zathari ships began to retreat with the desperate urgency of predators who had suddenly discovered they were prey. Admiral Vexhai's perfect fleet was broken, with 4 vessels destroyed and 3 more too damaged to continue fighting. His flagship limped through space-trailing debris and leaking atmosphere, its proud hull scarred by weapons that should not have been able to harm it. Jake Morrison watched the aliens flee and felt a grim satisfaction that was tempered by the knowledge that his ship was dying. The Defiance had given everything she had and more. Her old systems pushed far beyond their limits in a battle that no one had expected her to survive. But she had done something that would be remembered long after her hull was recycled into new ships. Sam Carter was not finished with his enemies yet. The cargo bays still held mining equipment that could be turned into weapons, and he had spent the last hour rigging cargo containers with guidance systems salvaged from civilian navigation computers. The containers were loaded with industrial explosives and programmed to home in on the largest metal signatures they could find. The improvised missiles launched from the Defiance's cargo bays like a swarm of metal wasps, their crude guidance systems locking onto the retreating Zathari vessels. The aliens tried to shoot down the approaching containers, But their weapons were designed for military targets with predictable flight patterns. The tumbling cargo pods moved with chaotic trajectories that confused every targeting computer. The first container struck Admiral Vexhi's flagship just as the alien commander was trying to coordinate his fleet's retreat. The explosion tore through the ship's damaged hull and triggered secondary detonations that lit up the darkness like a new star. The proud vessel that had led the attack on human space died in a ball of fire and twisted metal. Vexhi had time for one final thought as his ship came apart around him. He had been so certain of victory, so confident that superior technology would triumph over primitive determination. But the humans had taught him something that his advanced civilization had forgotten in its pursuit of perfection. Sometimes the simplest solutions were the most effective, and sometimes the oldest weapons were the deadliest. The remaining Zathari vessels accelerated away from the battle zone, with every bit of power their damaged engines could provide. Their perfect formation was gone, their coordination shattered, and their confidence broken. They had come to destroy a primitive human outpost and, instead, had been mauled by a single obsolete warship, crewed by people they had dismissed as insignificant. Ryan Clark monitored the alien communications as the survivors tried to explain their defeat to distant commanders who would not believe the reports. How could advanced warships be destroyed by mining equipment and industrial tools? How could a 100-year-old human vessel defeat technology that was centuries more advanced? The answers violated everything the Zathari thought they knew about warfare. Jake Morrison stood in the ruins of his bridge and looked at the crew that had accomplished the impossible. They were dirty and exhausted and wounded, but they were alive. They had taken the tools of their trade and turned them into weapons that could humble the greatest fleet in known space. They had proven that human ingenuity was worth more than all the advanced technology in the galaxy. The USS Defiance was dying, her old systems finally giving up after being pushed beyond all reasonable limits. But she had lived long enough to send a message that would reach every human colony and every alien fleet. The message was simple and clear. Humanity would not surrender, and anyone who tried to conquer them would discover that humans fought wars differently than civilized species. Danny Sullivan shut down the overloaded fusion reactor and watched the ship's power systems finally fail after hours of abuse that should have destroyed them in minutes. The engineering spaces were filled with smoke and sparks, but his modifications had worked. They had turned an obsolete warship into something that could stand against the most advanced technology in the galaxy. Amy Foster's tactical systems were dead, but she had learned something more valuable than any computer program could teach. She had learned that sometimes the best weapons were not weapons at all, just tools used by people who understood that survival meant using whatever you had in whatever way worked. The lesson would serve her well in the battles to come. Word of the battle spread through human space faster than the fastest ships could carry it. The story grew with each telling, but the core truth remained unchanged. A single ancient warship had defeated a Zathari fleet through human ingenuity and determination. The impossible had happened, and suddenly the war looked different to everyone involved. Human colonies that had been preparing to surrender began to reconsider their options. If an obsolete ship could defeat advanced aliens, then maybe humanity had a chance after all. Miners and engineers and frontier workers started looking at their equipment with new eyes, wondering what else could be turned into weapons if the need arose. The Zathari Confederation found themselves facing an enemy they did not understand. Their computers could analyze human technology and predict human tactics, but they could not comprehend human adaptability. The species they had dismissed as primitive was proving to be the most dangerous opponent they had ever faced, precisely because they refused to fight according to any recognizable rules. Other alien species began to take notice as well. The Zathari had seemed unstoppable with their perfect ships and flawless coordination, but the humans had found weaknesses that no one else had even looked for. Perhaps these strange bipeds from the edge of the galaxy were worth watching, and perhaps their chaotic approach to warfare contained lessons that more advanced civilizations could learn. Jake Morrison and his crew were eventually rescued by a human relief fleet, but their ship was beyond saving. The USS Defiance was given a hero's funeral, her battered hull finally allowed to rest after more than a century of faithful service. But her legacy lived on in the knowledge that human determination could overcome any technological advantage. The battle became known as the Miracle at New Perth, and it marked the beginning of the end for Zathari ambitions in human space. The aliens learned to respect an enemy who fought with mining charges and industrial lasers, who turned cargo containers into guided missiles, and used asteroid fields as weapons. They learned that sometimes the most primitive approach was the most effective. Years later, when the war was over and peace had been negotiated, alien historians would study the battle and try to understand how such an impossible victory had been achieved. They would write learned papers about human adaptability and the dangers of technological overconfidence. But they would never truly understand the simple truth that the crew of the Defiance had demonstrated. When humans are cornered, they do not just fight back, they fight dirty, and they win.